Talking about the Arab exception requires us to address the problematic nature of essentialism. This term describes the belief that there is a set of attributes that are necessary for an individual or group's identity and function. This essence is the one and only necessary attribute that defines and sets the person or group apart in all areas of human existence. Likewise, there is a tendency to treat Islam as a total civilization, not just a religion, but as a political and social system with divinely revealed and thus immutable law at its core. Insisting on the totality and indivisibility of Islam, it is held that it constitutes the essence of every Muslim's being, ultimately determining every facet of the Muslim's actions and thoughts. The aim of this exposition is not an apologia of the religion of Islam, nor the denial of rather obvious cultural problems. The Palestinian writer Faisal Daraj recognizes cultural predispositions as a major source of the problem. Writing in 2007 in his foreword to the first English translation of Sadiq al-Azam's seminal book, Self-Criticism After the Defeat, Daraj sees the failure of the Arab nations to live up to their self-chosen duty towards the Palestinians as grounded in their inability to come to grips with the demands of modernity, in particular critical thinking, rationality, and responsibility. This contrasts with the still prevailing view in popular and official Arab discourse that the defeat in the 1967 Six-Day War between Israel and several Arab nations, and by implications all subsequent military beatings, like the 2003 invasion and destruction of Iraq, were somehow external events as characterized by Sadiq al-Azam. Indeed, our use of the term Nakba, disaster, to indicate the June War and its aftermath contains much of the logic of exoneration and the evasion of responsibility and accountability, since whoever is struck by disaster is not considered responsible for it or its occurrence, and even if we were to consider him so, in some sense, his responsibility remains minimal in comparison with the terror and enormity of the disaster. This is why we ascribe disasters to fate, destiny, and nature, that is, to factors outside our control and for which we cannot be held accountable. Al-Azam cites the then contemporary Egyptian journalist Mohammed Haikal, who describes the 1967 war as follows: "We face a modern and learned foe, and there is no other solution available to the Arab side at the line of total confrontation but to be modern and learned." While this sounds like an honest analysis of the relative superiority of Israeli over Arab forces, Al-Azam isn't satisfied with it. He writes, "Just as one of you will not meet an Arab who does not consider himself of the party of charity, motherhood, and commanding the good and forbidding the bad, so you will not find an Arab who does not consider himself a friend of science, modernity, and progress. At this level of generality and abstraction, we all agree and our assent remains compulsory." Al-Azam points out that at such an abstract level, the hard choices that need to be made are deliberately downplayed. Embracing science, rationality, and progress requires giving up many things and mental states that are prized and constitutes crucial elements of identity. The radical changes in one's personal attitude, in social organization, in the very fabric of our lives that embracing, not merely submitting to, modernity requires is a painful process necessitating many bitter political struggles, as he continues. Are we prepared to accept the changes and transformations and to renounce all the things that we prized previously, if it is demonstrated that they exert a clear resistance to science and modernity? For science and modernity mean, for example, secularism and the separation of church and state. Who among our responsible leaders dares openly to state this instead of wrapping the truth inside fine-sounding generalities about science and modernity? Today, half a century later, Al-Azam's rhetorical questions have been answered. Arab societies have by and large not been willing to embrace these changes. Faisal Daraj acknowledges in his recent foreword that the 1967 defeat followed an unbroken chain of earlier defeats since the 19th century, and in turn was followed by defeat after defeat into the present age, perhaps most starkly symbolized by the Western invasions of Iraq in 2003 and Libya in 2011. The Raj is clear to place responsibility where it belongs. Like many others, 1967 was a homegrown defeat, that it did not have its source in external conspiracies, but in persistent Arab impotence distributed equally among the people and the authorities. Speaking of the Arab exception implies that there is a general pattern to which Arab states and societies do not conform. Before addressing that question, we do well in pondering briefly what is meant when we speak of Arab or any other developing nation's state failure or administrative and/or social dysfunction, and why it matters. Such terminology implies a yardstick against which the performance of Arab states and societies can be measured. In line with authors such as Hamilton, Kaufman, and others working with the World Bank, Fukuyama, Radley, and others working elsewhere, I argue that such a standard for effective governance can be found in states that perform better with respect to a number of quantifiable and important output indicators. As most of these better performing states have historically developed in Western Europe and its cultural outpost, what is summarily described as the West, there is an implicit assumption that studying their peculiar historical experience can teach us something about the creation of statehood and administrative capacity in general. I will return to the question of the suitability of the Western experience as a model for comparison in the next section. But at this point, let's briefly return to Daraj's affirmative restatement of Al-Azm's central thesis of the necessity for critical rational thinking and the acceptance of responsibility. For he realizes that the Arab world, like it or not, lives in a universal time, and that this universal time compares the achievements of one people and another, without regard to ancient glories, real or imagined. The critical comparison depends on a demonstrative reason relying on a comparative approach, an approach that affirms that the value of a given society is measured against the value of another, because human societies are not found in isolation. Now, this seems like a fairly straightforward statement in a globalized world where ideas, diseases, capital, goods, and services travel with ever greater ease. Still, these views remain highly controversial.